Peppa Pig, something in the house. The evening at the Pig household was unusually quiet. Peppa and George played in the living room while rain tapped softly against the windows. The dim light flickered and a strange tension filled the air. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the trees like eerie whispers in the night. Shadows from the flickering television danced against the walls, elongating into strange, distorted shapes. Then the door creaked open. Peppa turned quickly, her heartbeat quickening. The door had been closed. She was sure of it. Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig entered, but something was wrong. Their movements were too smooth, too silent, as if they glided rather than walked. Their eyes were empty, hollow voids, and their smiles were unnaturally wide, frozen in place like grotesque masks. The room grew cold. A chill seeped into Peppa's bones, numbing her fingertips. The air thickened, pressing against her chest, as if the room itself were alive. George clutched his dinosaur tighter, his little fingers trembling. The silence between them stretched, heavy with unseen dread. Daddy Pig's head twisted at an impossible angle, his neck creaking and popping as he turned 180 degrees to stare at them. Mummy Pig's posture shifted unnaturally, her body bending too far forward, her arms dangling lifelessly at her sides like a broken puppet. Then came the sound. A rhythmic click-clack of hooves echoed through the hallways, slow and deliberate. The footsteps did not belong to anyone they knew. Peppa grabbed George's hand, her grip firm, and without hesitation they bolted upstairs. Their feet pounded against the wooden steps, the house groaning beneath them. Peppa reached their bedroom, yanked George inside, and slammed the door shut, twisting the lock with shaking fingers. Silence. The handle began to turn, softly at first, then with more force. Peppa pressed her back against the door, willing it to hold. Then a slow, deliberate scratching at the wood. It was faint, methodical, like nails dragging just beneath the surface. A breathy whisper followed, an exhale too close, too deliberate. The shadows in the room began to shift, stretching along the walls in odd, angular shapes, pulsing as though the walls themselves were alive. The air grew colder still, wrapping around them like unseen fingers. Peppa felt her heart hammer against her ribs, her breath shallow and rapid. The house no longer felt like home. It had become something else, something dark, something watching, something waiting. And in the suffocating silence, Peppa knew they were not alone.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Peppa was taking a bath, splashing happily in the bubbles. Suddenly, the water turned murky, then black, and the bubbles began to pop with a sinister hiss. She tried to get out, but her hands slipped on the porcelain, as if the tub itself was holding her captive. A pair of glowing red eyes emerged from the black water, followed by a shadowy, elongated figure. It reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with sharp, black claws. Pause 30 seconds. Peppa screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the gurgling of the drain, which had transformed into a gaping maw. The figure pulled her deeper into the black water, its cold embrace tightening around her. She could hear faint whispers coming from the water, calling her name, inviting her to join its watery grave. The bathroom grew colder, and the shadows danced around her, making the distorted figure seem to come alive. She closed her eyes, wishing it was all a dream, but the cold touch on her cheek told her it was terrifyingly real. Pause 30 seconds. When she opened them again, the water was clear, and the figure was gone, but her reflection in the mirror was not her own. It was the shadowy figure, its glowing red eyes staring back at her, a sinister smile on its face. She knew she was trapped. The house creaked and groaned around her, each sound a chilling reminder of the presence lurking within. She could hear faint whispers, carried on the wind, calling her name. The air grew heavy, and a strange, sweet smell filled the room, making her dizzy. She felt a cold touch on her ankle, and a shiver ran down her spine. Peppa knew she wasn't alone. Pause 30 seconds. The shadows in her room seemed to deepen, twisting into grotesque shapes. She could feel eyes watching her from every corner. The house was no longer a safe haven, but a trap. She pulled the covers over her head, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She knew she had to escape, but where could she go? The house was alive and it wanted her. She could hear the floorboards groaning, the walls creaking, as if the house itself was closing in on her. The air was thick with an unseen presence, and she felt a suffocating weight on her chest. Peppa knew this was the end. The last thing she saw before darkness consumed her was her own reflection, now completely transformed, its glowing red eyes staring back at her. It was smiling, and then nothing, just the silence of the house, waiting for its next victim.
This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, the room that wasn't there. The day in the Pig family's house was as usual. Peppa and George were playing in the living room while Mummy Pig was cooking dinner and Daddy Pig was reading the newspaper. Everything was familiar, cozy. But in the evening, something strange happened. When Peppa went upstairs to her room, she noticed a door at the end of the hallway. It had never been there. The house wasn't that big, and Peppa knew exactly where everything was. At the end of the hallway, there had always been just a wall, but now there was a door. Ordinary-looking, wooden, with a round handle. George followed her, looking confused. A cold feeling settled inside Peppa. Maybe Mummy and Daddy had remodeled something. Maybe it had always been there and she just hadn't noticed. But the longer she stared, the more wrong it seemed. She had never heard anyone building anything new. And yet, the door was there. It was calling to be opened. Peppa cautiously reached for the handle. Inside was a room. Empty, bare walls, a dusty wooden floor. But the air inside was heavy, stale, as if no one had stepped inside for a very, very long time. Peppa took a step forward. Silence. But there was a feeling like someone was there, like someone had just been standing in that corner and moved the moment she entered. George tugged at her hoof, but Peppa didn't move. Something was wrong. They couldn't hear the television from the living room. They couldn't hear their parents' footsteps. Only silence. And then, a step. Peppa turned sharply, but the room was empty. Complete suffocating stillness. And then, the door began to close, slowly, soundlessly, as if someone was pushing it from the other side. Peppa and George lunged for the exit, but too late. The door slammed shut. Darkness. The room had no window, no drafts, not even a crack of light. Only absolute darkness and silence. Peppa yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. George curled into a ball, clutching his dinosaur tightly. And then Peppa heard breathing. Deep. Quiet. Not hers. Not George's. Someone else was in this room. Something was standing in the dark. Very close. The vanished house. One morning, Peppa and her family woke up in their usual home. Daddy Pig was warming up breakfast, Mummy Pig was making tea, and George was playing with his toys. Everything was calm. But when Peppa decided to step outside, she noticed something strange. Outside the window, there was no familiar green yard, and the sky looked dull and gray. Peppa went to the door and opened it. There was no sound, no people, just darkness. The yard was gone, and the house itself seemed to be surrounded by a dark, endless space. The walls of the house began to slowly disappear, as if dissolving into the air. Peppa tried to return inside, but the door slammed shut, and everything inside turned dark. She screamed and ran back to her parents, but they were sitting as if nothing had happened. Daddy Pig was still reading the newspaper, and Mummy Pig was still making tea. Peppa tried to tell them what had happened outside, but they didn't hear her. Then Peppa noticed that everyone in the house seemed strange. Daddy Pig no longer laughed, and Mummy Pig wasn't smiling. In search of answers, Peppa decided to step outside again. This time, when she stepped out, she found herself in an empty world. Everything around her was gray, with no trees or familiar buildings. Peppa turned around and saw the house she had lived in disappearing, turning into mist. In panic, she rushed back into the house, but now everything inside was as empty and gloomy as it was outside. Mummy and Daddy Pig were sitting in dark corners, their faces strange and lifeless. Then Peppa realized that her house was gone, and perhaps she was too. There were no traces of her family, nothing familiar. Everything had disappeared. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside. But something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig. This episode of the animated series Peppa Pig has never been shown on TV.
Peppa Pig, the letters on the wall. It started with a single phrase, a small message, as if scratched by something blunt. On the wall by the stairs, right under the handrail. Daddy Pig first thought George had been playing with a sharp toy block. "Who wrote this?" he asked at breakfast. "Not me," said George. "Me neither," added Peppa. "What does it say?" Daddy Pig frowned. "You forgot me." They thought it was just a childish prank. Mummy Pig wiped the wall with a damp cloth, and the writing disappeared. But the next morning, it showed up again, somewhere else, near the kitchen door. Same words. "You forgot me." "Mummy," said Peppa, "maybe it's leftover chalk. Or someone's drawing at night." "No one's drawing, Peppa. It's just a coincidence." But on the third day, the writing was in Peppa and George's room, right next to the bed, written by a small hoof, tiny letters, crooked pressure, as if whoever wrote it was rushing or didn't know how to hold the chalk. "I didn't write it," Peppa repeated. "I swear." "Maybe you just don't remember," Mummy said gently. "Maybe it happened in a dream." But Peppa hadn't been asleep. She remembered clearly. And that night, she woke up to a soft sound, a scratchy noise, dry, like something scraping against plaster. She sat up and saw the bedroom door slightly open. Light from the hallway fell on the wall, and there, in the shadow, something moved. Peppa couldn't see a face, only a hoof, scraping against the wall again and again. When she turned on her nightlight, the figure was gone, but a new message had appeared. "You erased me." Now the writing showed up every day, in the bathroom, on the wardrobe, under the table, even on the inside of the window glass, all written by one hoof, all saying the same thing. "Who is it?" Peppa asked George. "Maybe it's someone you forgot," he whispered. On the sixth night, Peppa woke up and saw someone writing on the wall right in front of her bed. She didn't move, didn't breathe. The figure didn't turn around, just a shadow, a shape, and when the message was finished, it melted into the darkness, quiet, smooth. "You were me." Peppa shivered. Her eyes moved to the mirror, and she saw a reflection, herself, almost. But the one in the mirror didn't move, didn't blink, just stared, and words began to appear on the glass. "You took my place." In the morning, Mummy Pig called her for breakfast. "Peppa, aren't you hungry?" Peppa didn't reply. She didn't feel like herself anymore. And on the wall above the table appeared one final message, written in that same crooked hoof writing. "Now you are forgotten." It all began subtly. Peppa was the first to notice that her little brother George had changed. At first, it was just small things. He became quieter than usual, stopped laughing, and played less with his favorite dinosaur. He often sat on the floor by the window, tracing shapes on the carpet with his fingers. At first, Peppa thought it was just a game, but then she realized the shapes were always the same. Circles, and in the center of each, two long stretched eyes. "George, what are you drawing?" she asked, trying to peek closer. But he didn't answer. His gaze was empty, as if he wasn't looking at the drawings at all, but sinking somewhere deep inside himself. With each passing day, it grew worse. George stopped responding to her words, ate less and less, and at night, Peppa heard him whispering strange words in his sleep. Sometimes he would get up and stand motionless in the middle of the room, his eyes fixed on the darkness. One evening, he finally looked up at her, and Peppa's heart froze. His eyes were completely empty. The smile stretching across his face was unnatural, alien. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered in a low, hollow voice. One that didn't belong to her brother, but to someone older, someone else entirely. And after those words, he simply melted into the darkness. Peppa screamed, called for her parents, but they only said she must have had a nightmare. The next day, George returned. He sat at the table, eating porridge, as if nothing had happened. But when Peppa met his gaze, he leaned toward her and whispered, "You're next." On the floor lay his dinosaur, torn to pieces, threads sticking out, strange red marks on its body, as if clawed fingers had ripped through it. Peppa could no longer pretend nothing was happening. She noticed something else. In the hallway mirror, George's reflection lived its own life. When George himself sat still, the reflection turned its head and stared at her. Sometimes its lips moved, and one day, Peppa clearly heard, "He is already with us." No adult noticed anything. Mummy and Daddy said everything was fine, that George was healthy, but deep inside, Peppa felt it. Her brother was slipping away into somewhere else, and she was powerless to stop it. A few days later, he was gone for good. His bed was empty. On the pillow lay a piece of paper, the letters jagged and crooked. "He is with us now." Peppa clutched the note, her hands trembling. The house felt colder. The silence hung heavy and thick. That night she awoke to a strange sound. From the bathroom came a droning murmur, but it wasn't water. It was a melody, faint, hollow, as if played on an old radio. Peppa tiptoed down the hallway, each step echoing loudly. She pushed the bathroom door open and froze. Something was crawling out of the toilet. Its body writhed, slick with slime. Its eyes glowed red, and mingled with the bubbling sound was a dreadful melody. The same haunting tune, repeating again and again. Tralalelo, tralala. It seemed to sing, the sound spreading through the pipes, through the walls, straight into her head. Peppa gripped the doorframe, her whole body shaking. The creature was enormous, rising higher and higher, stretching its long arms toward her. Its head tilted to the side, moving slowly, and then it shook, as if to say, "You can't run." Peppa's throat went dry. She tried to scream, but no voice came out. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The thing slithered closer, its red eyes burning brighter, the melody swelling until it filled the entire house. Peppa stumbled back, step by step, until her back hit the wall. She knew this was connected to George, his disappearance, his words, the strange patterns on the floor. All of it led here. And then she saw him. On the shelf in the hallway sat Labubu, her favorite toy, always harmless before, but now his eyes glowed red and his smile was twisted. He didn't move, yet his gaze said clearly, "You're next." Peppa felt the cold seep inside her. She realized George had only been the first. Now it was her turn. This is the story of what happened when Peppa Pig's family went to the beach for what they thought would be a normal day. But sometimes the most dangerous predators wear the most innocent disguises. It was a sunny day when the pig family arrived at the beach. Peppa was building sandcastles when she noticed strange footprints in the sand. Clear impressions of sneakers leading directly from the ocean onto the beach. "Daddy, look at these footprints," Peppa called out. Daddy Pig chuckled. Someone probably just walked into the water wearing their shoes. But Peppa followed the sneaker prints towards some large rocks. As she got closer, she heard soft melodic humming. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la. Peppa crept around the rocks and gasped. Sitting on the sand was an enormous shark wearing bright blue Nike sneakers, singing happily to itself. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, the shark sang, noticing Peppa. It grinned with rows of sharp teeth. "Hello there! Want to play?" Despite her fear, Peppa found herself playing beach ball with the creature, watching as it skillfully kicked the ball with its sneaker-clad fins. "You're really good at this," Peppa laughed. "Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la! I love to play," the shark sang back. That evening, a loud knock echoed through their house. When Daddy Pig opened the door, there stood the shark, still wearing its blue sneakers. "Hello, I've come to visit. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la," the shark announced, pushing inside and making itself at home. The shark squeezed through the doorway and began devouring everything at the dinner table. Plates, food, even the tablecloth. "What on earth is happening?" Mummy Pig exclaimed. "I was hungry. Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la." It sang with its mouth full. From that day forward, everything changed. The shark decided to stay and established new rules. Everyone had to wear sneakers and sing tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la throughout the day. The shark took over Peppa's bedroom, forcing her to sleep on a mat. One night, Peppa and George tried to sneak out, but the shark was waiting at the door. "Where do you think you're going? Tra-la-lilo, tra-la-la, nobody leaves my family." It sang menacingly, dragging them back inside. The house transformed quickly. Windows were sealed with thick glass, water filled the lower floors, and a sign appeared reading, "Danger, aggressive shark inside." Neighbors would walk by and hear singing from inside, "Tra-la-lee-lo, tra-la-la." We're all one family now. Through the round window, you could see them, Peppa, George, Mummy Pig and Daddy Pig, all wearing blue sneakers, all singing the shark's song. Behind them, the massive silhouette swam in circles, its toothy grin never fading. And so the shark had found its perfect family. The beach was quiet again, but if you listen carefully, you might still hear it. Tra-la-lee-lo, tra-la-la. And if you do, you'd better run, because the shark is always looking for new family members to join its endless song. The night was unusually quiet in Peppa Pig's cozy house. The silence was so heavy that even the creak of the floorboards beneath the blanket of sleep seemed too loud. And then it came, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap at Peppa's window. She pulled the blanket tighter over her head, but her eyes stayed wide open with fear. It wasn't the sound of rain or the rustle of branches. This was different, intentional, as if someone knew she was awake. Suddenly, a shadow flashed across the glass. Light, stretched, but unnerving. And Peppa recognized it instantly. It was Ballerina Cappuccina. Only now she didn't look the same. Her usually elegant figure was withered, almost dried out. Her legs moved in jerks, and her eyes were locked on Peppa with a disturbing, relentless intensity. She wasn't knocking with her hands, but with the tip of a worn ballet slipper, and each strike sent a chill through the room. Tap, tap, tap. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, hoping it would stop, but the knocking grew louder. Now it sounded like a drum, setting a rhythm. Ballerina Cappuccina twirled just outside the window, her movements unnatural, a grotesque parody of her former grace. She spun and never looked away from Peppa, a silent invitation to come outside. At that moment, George stirred in his sleep and mumbled softly, "Peppa, make it stop." Peppa's heart tightened. She understood. If she stood up, it would become real. But if she stayed in bed, the sound would drive her mad. And suddenly, through the knocks and scraping, came a faint whisper, not from the window, but from inside her head. "You're watching this, aren't you? Press the HYPE button under the video." Peppa flinched. It felt like the words belonged to Cappuccina herself, as though her voice was woven into the eerie tune like a broken music box. For a second, it was clear. Someone was calling not just to Peppa, but to the one watching with her. The tapping didn't stop. It grew into a full symphony. Cappuccina struck the glass harder and harder, her movements becoming frantic. Her dress whipped like torn fabric, and with each pirouette she seemed closer. Even though the window was shut, Peppa could see the slipper leaving dents in the glass. "Peppa, join my dance," whispered Cappuccina. Her voice was sweet, like a lullaby, but within it was a coldness that pierced to the bone. George whimpered and turned toward the wall, while Peppa clutched the blanket, realizing this wasn't a dream. Then the lamp in the room flickered on, casting light on something even more dreadful. On the floor, right by the bed, footprints appeared, tiny imprints of worn ballet slippers moving toward her. But Cappuccina was still outside the window. That meant only one thing. She could be in two places at once. The room filled with the echo of steps. The walls seemed alive, reflecting the dance. It was as though the entire space had become a stage, and Peppa the unwilling audience. But an audience with no choice. She would have to step onto the stage too. "One more step, and you'll stay with me forever," sang Cappuccina, her voice now coming from both outside and inside the room. The glass cracked. Peppa gasped and clutched George tightly. She knew one wrong move and the ballerina would be beside her, but staying still was unbearable. Then came the loudest strike. The window shattered into shards, and Cappuccina's slipper stepped onto the carpet. She made a graceful curtsy, her eyes flaring red, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. The music of the broken box filled the house, the walls trembled, and the shadows on the ceiling began to dance along with her. Peppa screamed, but the sound was drowned out in the monstrous symphony. Ballerina Cappuccina reached out a hand to Peppa. "Now it's your turn," she whispered, and Peppa understood. The knocking would never stop. The dance would never end. She was next.
This episode of the animated series, Peppa Pig, has never been shown on TV. Peppa Pig. Mom is no longer the same. The day was gray and rainy. The clouds hung low over the pig family's house, the wind shook the trees, and raindrops drummed against the windows. Daddy Pig had gone out on business, and Mummy Pig went shopping, leaving Peppa and George at home. They played in the living room, building towers out of blocks, but something felt off. The house seemed quieter than usual, as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something. Time dragged on. It was getting dark outside, but Mummy Pig still hadn't returned. Then the lock clicked. The children jumped. The door slowly creaked open. Mummy Pig stepped inside, but something was wrong. Her movements were slow, uneven, as if her body had forgotten how to move. Her wet clothes clung to her skin, but she didn't shake off the rain, didn't take off her boots, didn't say a word. She just stood there, unblinking, staring at the children. The living room grew cold. The air thickened with a strange heaviness, like the moment before a storm. Peppa squeezed George's hand. Mummy Pig's eyes weren't the same. The whites had turned too pale, almost gray, and her pupils had dilated so much that her eyes looked like two black voids. But the most terrifying thing was her mouth. It hung slightly open. Her lips twitched as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Peppa waited for Mummy to speak, but she just stood there. Then, she stepped forward. The floorboards didn't creak. It was as if her feet weren't touching the ground at all. The lights in the room flickered as though the air had thickened, turning heavier. Mummy Pig moved again. But now her movements became unnatural, fluid, like a puppet suspended on strings. Her head tilted slowly, and in the dim light, Peppa noticed something strange. Something was moving beneath her skin. Dark shapes slithered under the surface of her face, as if hundreds of tiny creatures were living inside. Peppa shivered, but the worst came in the next moment. Mummy Pig lunged forward, suddenly like a broken doll. Her whole body jerked forward, and her mouth stretched open wider than should be possible. Peppa heard a sound for the first time. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a chorus of hundreds of voices speaking at once. The house shuddered. The curtains twisted with writhing shadows. The walls cracked, and from the gaps in the floorboards, a black liquid seeped out. Mummy Pig rose above the ground. Her arms elongated, her fingers became too thin, and from her mouth something slipped out, black, writhing, alive. The shadows in the room folded into a single mass and swarmed forward. Peppa screamed, but there was no sound. All she could hear were footsteps coming closer, the footsteps of something that was no longer Mummy Pig.